We think we know how Chris Knoblauch's going to deploy the Edmonton Oilers lineup. Does it make sense?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Serrars. This will be my 10th NHL season doing digital hockey content, my 4th as a host here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And I want to thank everyone that is making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network where we've got your team covered every single day. And today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com and win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, on today's edition of Locked On Oilers, as insinuated, we're going to talk about what the Oilers' purported regular season lineup is going to look like based on what we've seen in the preseason, what we've seen reported, and what we expect based on certain logical points of order. So to start out, I'd like to walk you guys through, especially if you're new here, if you're not an everydayer, through my lineup construction philosophy. Because there are a few considerations to consider when we are putting together our lineup. Ideally, we want to have a variety of skills, of traits, of styles. And your best case is a lineup that is capable of cycling, forechecking, killing clock, of creating dangerous scoring chances off of the rush with lateral cross-seam passes, high skill players making plays outside of normal structure. And the Oilers, when they have been at their best over the last year and change under Chris Knoblauch, and Chris Knoblauch himself has insinuated and pointed this out, he feels the Oilers are at their best when they play Leon Draisaitl and Connor McDavid separate from each other. Now, Friday's episode of Locked On Oilers was entirely about that dynamic. What does it mean for the Oilers if McDavid and Draisaitl play together versus when they aren't? And what does the data say? And what do the underlying results say? And by and large, you are guaranteeing yourself game control. And as we talked about quite a bit on last Friday's show, game control does not necessarily correlate to game success. We talk about process versus results, how those aren't always necessarily going to be in alignment. You can do all of the right things and still come up short. And that's the dangerous game of loading Connor and Leon up on the same line together. And that's where we're going to start. So at least as of right now, the Oilers are playing, as of the time of this recording, they have McDavid, Draisaitl, and Trent Frederic together. And there is a part of me, and this is entirely my speculation. I obviously have not spoken to Stan Bowman about this. I think there is a world where Stan Bowman looks at Trent Frederic and says, why can't that be my Zach Hyman? Somebody who played a supporting cast role on a different team. In Zach Hyman's case, it was those Leafs teams where he would ride with Marner, he would ride with Austin Matthews, occasionally with Tavares and Nylander, as a menace, a forechecker, somebody to get pressure on the other team, and an above average shooter. You know, Zach Hyman's had some really good shooting percentage seasons, has a couple 15, he has one 18% shooting season, and the Oilers tapped into something with Zach Hyman by increasing his responsibility. By giving him more minutes per game, he was able to take a more hands-on role. And by playing him with Connor McDavid at even strength, you are allowing McDavid to create the zone entries. You are allowing McDavid to be the distributor, the playmaker, and really allow Zach Hyman to hone in on what he's good at: forechecking, playing the walls, and net front play and his shot. So why does this work? So I'm glad you asked. When we're talking about our lineup composition, in theory, as our three skill sets, at least as a baseline, and now there are some guys who are good at more than one facet, but we want a puck retriever, a puck distributor, and a puck shooter. Those are the three skill sets, archetypes we would like to have one of on each line. When you play McDavid and Draisaitl and Trent Frederic, you have 2 playmakers, you have 2 shooters, and you have 1 forechecker. That is a very diverse line. That is a line that is going to be able to create dangerous offense, that is going to be able to create game control offense. And Trent Frederic will have more opportunities to score, to play dangerous offense, because of the respect that McDavid and Draisaitl command as both passers and shooters of the puck. So there's a world where Trent Frederic, even though we know Connor and Leon and Trent Frederic will not stay together as the first line the entire season, I think as soon as Zach Hyman comes back, frankly, I think if they get off to a slow start, game 1, we could see Andrew Mangiapane in that spot as well. But I think there's a world where the Oilers think Trent Frederic is waiting to be tapped into. We did an episode about this a couple of weeks ago, and it did really well views-wise on YouTube, more than usual for that time of year in August. But there's a lot of curiosity here when it comes to Trent Frederic from Oiler fans at large, because we didn't get a great look at him last year in the playoffs, and he played the 1 regular season game before re-aggravating that ankle injury, but he very clearly wasn't himself. But at the same time, this is a former first-round pick, somebody who has played meaningful, not huge, but meaningful roles on quality Bruins teams as a third liner on that team that won the President's Trophy a couple years ago. Somebody who the Oilers feel with slightly more responsibility, with more opportunity, might be able to inch up towards that 20-goal mark. And again, 20 goals from a top 6 winger should be your bare minimum expectation. And I understand it's a little bit funky for the Oilers because your path to power play one time as a non-McDavid, Draisaitl, or Hyman forward is a bit tricky to chart. And it really does depend what the Oilers want. And especially when no Zach Hyman for the first month of the season, we might see some funky things on the power play. We might see some awkward configurations or talent deployments and trying to figure out what they can do in a triage basis without Hyman. But playing McDavid, Draisaitl, and Frederic together makes a lot of sense in a vacuum. Of course, this doesn't account for the fact the Oilers are probably leaving the rest of their lineup a little light. But in a vacuum, skill sets wise, this matches up really well. You have McDavid and Draisaitl to create zone entries with speed, to whip pucks laterally, to gain the offensive zone, leave the drop pass, attack the net. And then you have Trent Frederic to be the errand boy, to do the dirty work, to forecheck, to hit guys, to go get loose pucks, to get the puck for Connor and Leon. And again, like I said before, playing Frederic with Connor and Leon is going to open a lot of space for him. Think about what playing with Leon did for Podkolzin last year, for Kasperi Kapanen in bursts last year, what it did for Dylan Holloway on Leon's line a couple years ago in the playoffs. When you get the opportunity to play with high-end players, if you have the tools to keep up pace-wise and maybe instincts-wise where the game isn't too fast for you, even if you're not the most talented player, you can carve out a really nice career for yourself. You think about some of the stuff guys like Chris Kunitz and Pascal Dupuis did in Pittsburgh, playing with Sidney Crosby or Evgeny Malkin. You think about some of the work that guys like maybe Orion Strome did, playing with Artemi Panarin in New York. You think about some of the work guys like Leo Komarov did, playing with Matt Barzal on the Islanders. You do not need to be an elite player to play on the first line. You just can't be someone who sinks it. And I think Trent Frederic has enough, and I know this might be a bit of a contrarian take, especially from me, who's so data inclined and so evidence-based. I can see the argument for this and see a world where Trent Frederic gets to that 20-goal mark. Stan Bowman gets to stand there kind of smugly and say, I know what I'm doing. And that's the best case scenario here. And again, real quick before we take our first break, these lines will not stay the same all season. That's a given. This is hockey. Lines change literally shift to shift. So important to note that. But to start out, I do like the idea of Frederic riding with Draisaitl and McDavid. We are going to take our first break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk about whether or not Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is qualified to center a second line on a Stanley Cup contender in 2025. Most people can't name all their financial accounts, or even what they're worth, whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments. And when you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why there's Monarch Money. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or phone. Monarch is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch is here for you. Monarch does all of the heavy lifting. With Monarch Money, you can link all of your accounts in minutes, see clear data visualizations, get smart categorization of spending, and finally feel in control of your money. And Monarch Money promises you will never, ever touch a spreadsheet. Monarch Money made me aware I wasn't saving as much money as I needed to for some of my long-term plans. I'm going on vacation this upcoming weekend. Monarch Money gives you a targeted plan, action steps to get there, what you need to put aside to make it happen. Do not let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for half off your first year subscription. One more time, that's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers, trying to get the week started off on a good note. Hopefully everybody had a safe and fun weekend. I, for one, am quite tired. I do think I have finally beaten the cold that had my voice in shambles for most of the last week, but man, there simply are not enough hours in the day. I could go on and on about how fast the weekend goes when you're booked and busy, but getting back to our Oilers, getting back to the topic at hand, this lineup, the construction, what we're seeing, I don't mind, especially in Zach Hyman's absence, a bit more of a floor prioritization in roster construction. And that's something I wanted to hit on in the first segment, in particularly in regards to Ike Howard and Matthew Savoie, who it feels like I've spent the entire summer singing the hopeful praises of, that if the Oilers would like to eventually win something, those guys are likely going to play key roles. And for those guys to eventually have the capacity to play key roles, the Oilers cannot shy away from the difficult part of player development. And that is giving underqualified, or in some cases outright unqualified players, roles they might not be ready for. I am not the hugest proponent of sink or swim when it comes to young guys, especially if we're talking about high leverage positions. And, quarterback is the most obvious one in football. I was very reticent, frankly, of the Giants throwing Jackson Dart into the deep end against Jesse Minter's Chargers defense, who were undefeated coming into today and had been one of the best defenses in football coming into the season. But there comes a point in a young player's life cycle where they need to play. They are only going to get better. And frankly, you're only going to be able to evaluate them when they get those opportunities. So without Zach Hyman in the mix, the Oilers are going to need to prioritize their floor for a little while. And the Oilers can look to optimize for ceiling, peak, being able to get the most out of their lineup once Hyman's back. Once you have Hyman back and you can get back to Connor and Hyman, you get to Leon, you'll pick who he rides with, but I have a strong feeling that Matthew Savoie is going to be one of the candidates. And I think, frankly, Matthew Savoie has a bit of an easier path to being an NHL regular. I think the fact that he can kill penalties is a plus. I think that little cup of coffee he had last year, the results he had generated playing with Leon, I think that was something to point out as well. But the big point here, as far as talking about a second line centered by Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, I think you are limiting the ceiling, but I think if you play him, especially based on what we've seen so far with Andrew Mangiapane and Vasily Podkolzin, that would be a really good third line. I think if the Oilers can add another winger at some point down the road, or one of Matthew Savoie or Ike Howard really jumps up the pecking order, I think there's a world where a Mangiapane, Podkolzin, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins third line could be pretty nails. I think there's a world where that could be a pretty close facsimile of what the Lightning were getting out of Yanni Gourde, Barclay Goodrow, and Blake Coleman all those years ago when they won back-to-back Stanley Cups. Now, it's a little less than ideal, but for right now, knowing that you're going to load Connor and Leon up together, it's not bad. I think Nuge, Podkolzin, and Mangiapane all fit varying degrees. And I will say this line lacks a traditional shoot first forward. I think in the Oilers' mind, Andrew Mangiapane is going to be the shoot first guy on this line. And that is not necessarily a bad thing. I have always been a proponent of Mangiapane's game. I think the season he produced that 30 goals in for the Flames those a couple of years ago, obviously that's the high ends. That's an outlier season. But I think he is capable of providing more than he did in Washington last year, where he was largely 10th, 9th forward on a very good Capitals team, mind you. You know, Capitals finished second in the President's Trophy race. I don't think it's anything to sneeze at there, but Mangiapane fits the box of the traditional dart throw in free agency. Somebody who has demonstrated a couple seasons of pretty good production, maybe hasn't done it in a while, or is coming off a down year, coming off an injury, looking to get PT with good players. And I can very easily see a world where Mangiapane gets stapled to one of Draisaitl or McDavid, and he plays as a super forechecker, where they have Mangiapane's singular role being getting the puck in deep, thumping that defenseman who's trying to play the puck, and going to town. I think there is a great opportunity there for Mangiapane in this role, especially once the lineup is a little more well-rounded once Hyman comes back. But in this capacity, with Nugent-Hopkins and Podkolzin, I think there's a lot of juice here for this to be a pretty good matchup line. And there are limitations to Nugent-Hopkins' game at this point. He has never been a particularly physical player. I think whenever you have somebody who's in what we would define as a matchup or checking line center role, you typically like that guy to be a defense-first player. And Nuge definitely doesn't profile as a defense-first guy. He's not a liability by any means. He's been killing penalties for the Oilers forever. But I do think there is a world where that's a slightly more upgraded player, and maybe Nuge, if you want him in a bit more of a defensive capacity, could do it on the wing. But this is not a bad second line. It's not quite what the Oilers need if they would like to go where they want to. But considering the limitations right now with injuries, I think there is some upside here, particularly in the case of Mangiapane, where if you just give him a little bit of run, you get his confidence going just a little bit, I think you could squeeze a lot out of that guy. And in this role on the line that is going to try and grind opponents into a pulp, they are going to be a really good game control line. I think this group has the capacity to play at a really, really solid level. And it will not produce gaudy counting stats. I really don't think any of these guys really profile anymore as 30-goal, 60, 70-point players. I think if the Oilers get a 60-point season at a Nuge at this point, I think that is extremely fortunate. I think that would be better than the best-case scenario, frankly. It's not that Nuge is bad. He's just at a different stage of his career now. His role on the team is a little bit different, as evidenced by the fact that the Oilers are looking him to center his own line and be part of the bottom nine that's going to need to raise the floor on every given night. And down the road, I think you probably see Nuge get bumped lower in the lineup or move back to the wing. But for right now, I like that line on paper a lot. I think it has a lot of potential to be a really solid game control line. And really quickly, we're talking about two lines who can produce solid game control, and that's without Zach Hyman. You get Zach Hyman in the mix, you put Leon back on his own line, and you can get two lines. And then if you bump Nuge down the third line center, and look, we're going to talk about David Tomasek centering a line in our third and final segment as well, but I think the Oilers have a lot of options here, and I do think that is a good thing. I know last week I had made the joke about the Bill Parcells, if you have two quarterbacks, you don't have one. But I do think there's a world where all of this interchangeability, you know, the fact Trent Frederic can play wing or center, the fact Mangiapane can play left or right, that Tomasek can play center, that Nugent-Hopkins can play center or wing. I think anytime you have that flexibility, as a coach, you can really show your understanding of your guys by putting them in a position to succeed. But we're going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll walk through the bottom six of this forward group based on what we've seen so far and what those line combinations say about the team going forward. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss. Because right now, new FanDuel customers can bet just $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if your first bet wins. That's right. Pick a bet. Put down $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use on the FanDuel app. I love using FanDuel because it has so many ways to play. If you want to put together a same game parlay for a squad ride, if you want to play player props instead of game outcomes, or if you get a feeling as the game's happening and you want to get in the mix, live betting makes it happen. Tonight, we got a double header on Monday Night Football. The Jets going down to Miami, where the Jets are 2.5-point underdogs on the road. And then the Joe Burrow-less Cincinnati Bengals heading to Denver to take on the Broncos, where the Bengals are 7.5-point road underdogs to Sean Payton and Denver. And then, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but 49ers at the Rams on Thursday. That will be real good football. So FanDuel has one question. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are getting set. We are just a shade over a week away from the start of the NHL season. We do have a crossover edition with some of the other hosts from within the Pacific Division coming up on the way as well. We have the NHL 100 project on the horizon, announcing the 100 best players in the league. I was very excited that the network was able to put that together. I will do my own list for full transparency at some point later in the week, probably not as an episode, because if I was to do 100 players, I would need to break that up over like 3 or 4 episodes, and I don't think you guys would get a whole lot about me talking about 100 different players for 45 seconds to 1 minute each for 100 of them. I think if I were to do something like that, that would be a multi-month project where I would take most of the summer to break it down, because I want to highlight just what makes certain guys special. And in that vein, continuing this conversation, this lineup construction conversation, I'm really curious why David Tomasek is getting the middle. Obviously, he has experience playing center over in Sweden. That was his natural position over there. But I am curious, especially considering that they do have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, that they have Podkolzin, that they have Trent Frederic, that they have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, that they have guys who can play center, and Tomasek, who just doesn't have a lot of NHL experience there. But I do think the reason they're doing that, I think they understand Adam Henrique's limitations now. And to his credit, Adam Henrique does look a little bit faster in preseason. I had read that he had slimmed down. He lost 5 to 10 pounds, something like that, really prioritized his physical fitness, really trying to get as lean as he could to be as fast as he could, because that used to be Adam Henrique's game. When he was with the Ducks, when he was with the Devils, he used to be really fast in a straight line. And look, obviously at his age, you're going to lose foot speed. That's just the natural age curve. Obviously, 36 is not old by any measure when we're talking about the scale of life. But in the hockey world, 36 might as well be 100. You might as well be talking about John F. Kennedy at this point, as far as Henrique goes. But Henrique, David Tomasek, and Matthew Savoie is interesting. I think you look at Savoie as the distributor. I think you look at Tomasek as a playmaker as well. I think you're going to need one of those guys to take a bit of initiative as a shoot first guy, because I think they both profile a little more as distributors, as playmakers. But Adam Henrique's not a slouch. Like, Adam Henrique's career average is 22 goals in the NHL. Obviously, at this point, you get anything more than 10 from him, that's a pretty good outcome. But I think you don't necessarily want your plays in 2025 or 2026 ending on Adam Henrique shots. And look, real quick on this topic before we talk about the fourth line and call it a day. When I say generalizations like that, you don't want plays ending on an Adam Henrique shot, obviously everybody needs to shoot at certain points to keep defenses honest. You know, teams would pick up on the fact that only David Tomasek was shooting or only Connor McDavid was shooting. And you want to have a variety of ways to beat people. That's what we talked about at the top. The idea you want the different skill sets. You want to have the capacity to play for a high ceiling or a high floor, depending on the given game, depending on the circumstances. And this group, I think, is one winger short. Even with Zach Hyman back, I think this group is one winger short of where they need to be. I think you cannot endure the type of brain drain they've had over the last 2 years without taking an honest stab at trying to upgrade somewhere. And look, I think Mangiapane is perfectly fine. I am banking on him having a bounce-back season. But I think you really need one of Matthew Savoie or Ike Howard to hit for this group to go where it wants to go. And that brings us to the fourth line, because right now there is a decent chance Ike Howard might start the season on the fourth line. And I think that's a mistake. I think, frankly, if you are going to have a guy who former first-round pick, Hobie Baker Award winner, he either needs to be on the first line in Bakersfield or he needs to be in the top 9 here in Edmonton. I don't think he's going to gain a whole lot from playing with Matthias Janmark. I don't think there's a lot to gain from giving Ike Howard such limited skill sets. You know, if you're going to play Ike Howard with Janmark or Lazar and Kapanen, I think there's real limitations there. I just think you're going to want more from that group. I think, frankly, very similarly to what we did last year as far as Jeff Skinner goes, you don't play Jeff Skinner on your fourth line. He doesn't fit there. Jeff Skinner is a good hockey player, don't get me wrong, but when you have upside guys who have plus traits as skaters or shooters, the fourth line is out there to kill time. The fourth line is out there to get the puck deep in the other team's zone, to try and cycle, to grind, to kill 45 seconds to a minute, to hopefully stay in the offensive zone long enough that you can facilitate a change in the offensive zone, or at the very least, keep game control as you make a line change, because teams don't have the level of talent necessary to stack 4 lines. It's just too expensive to have 4 lines of quality play. So that's why bottom sixes are constructed the way they are, where they're playing a little bit more for what I would classify as high floor, you know, low risk, get pucks in deep, try and grind the other team down, cycle the puck. That stuff has merit. I don't think you're going to get great play out of Ike Howard doing that. I think in that case, you play Noah Phillip on the fourth line and you tell Ike Howard, play 30 games in Bakersfield, get your feet under you, put on 5 to 10 pounds, and let's go. You'll be up here in December. We want you to play as many minutes as you possibly can right now, because right now we don't have a path to you playing in the top 9. I think sneaky if you could get him on a line with Tomasek and Savoie. And look, I know the Oilers don't want to play Savoie and Howard on the same line. I think there's a bit of reticence to that, but at the same time, that's what you need. You need a distributor and you need a shooter. Now, is Tomasek going to be the puck chaser for them? Maybe, maybe not. But it is something I would like to consider. That will do it, though, for this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers, breaking down what the Oilers lineup probably is going to look like going into next week's first week of the season. We'll see if we get any updates on Jake Walman's injury, Connor McDavid contract extension, when Vasily Podkolzin is going to come back from Russia after suffering a loss in the family. So there's a lot to get to this upcoming week. We will continue to set the tone looking ahead in that direction. Thank you to everyone who made Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your teams covered every day. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're on one of those feeds, please leave the show a 5-star review. It does worlds for me. If you're over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. We're inching up towards 2,600 subscribers. Thank you to everyone who is getting on board now ahead of the season. Thank you so much. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.